Okay, this is the third session in the module on organisational resilience and reliability, and in this session and henceforward we're going to cover the areas out of the book I co-wrote with Elmer Kutsch and Neil Turner on resilience, and in this first section we're picking up vigilance and awareness. So the point about this is that we're interested in the extent to which organisations can scan the horizon, look for risk, look for uncertainty, both within the organisation and across the wider environment within which they operate, and use that information to better their understanding of the nature of risk and uncertainty that they face. So this ties in very much with the stuff we talked about in the first session on risk and uncertainty, and in the second section as well, where I talked about systems and systems thinking. Okay, so this picture of a crystal ball is fairly appropriate really for this session, because what we're interested in is the extent to which people in organisations can predict the future. Is it possible to even predict the future? To what extent can that be done? And in some ways, is it like looking into a crystal ball? And if we can look into a crystal ball, can we make better forecasts, better predictions, and use that to better understand how our organisation needs to be prepared for the vicissitudes it will face? Okay, I had a little quote from Name of the Rose. It's a nice quote, really. William Baskerville, who's one of the main characters, or is the main character in Name of the Rose, says he's never doubted the truth of signs, and it's how the only thing man has to orient himself in the world. So we think about signs. What's out there? What's coming? What's in the future? Then what he goes on to say is, what I did not understand was the relationship among signs. It's the relationship between things we see in the future and how these will impact upon us and what we're doing. Okay, so I think in the first session I presented you with this diagram, and it was actually one of two diagrams. The first one being a sudden disaster which befalls an organisation, and then this one, which is where we see a creeping problem emerging for an organisation. In the first one, our view, which we take in our book, is that actually most organisations rarely encounter sudden disasters. What's much more commonplace is a creeping disaster or a creeping problem which could impact on the organisation, maybe catastrophically. And so it's vital that organisations are able to detect the early weak signals of problems which are emerging within their operations. So some of the key issues for this session are: how can we better foresee the future? So how can people in organisations not only foresee the future but better foresee the future? How can they improve their forecasts? How far can we meaningfully look ahead? So what sort of time horizons are we talking about? And how can we keep an eye on uncertainty and complexity? Now, with each of these sessions from henceforward, I will begin with what we've called a lure. These are quotes I've taken out of our book. We started every chapter with one of these lures, and the first one is about the lure of certainty. This is the dilemma or problem facing organisations. We call it a central challenge, and it lies with the way people think. People are naturally tempted to fall back on ideas of a world of certainty because people are more comfortable with it. So we like certainty, people like certainty, and so that's how they think of the world. They tend to avoid or seek to ignore uncertainty, risk, problems they may encounter, because these are uncomfortable things. So it's a natural tendency. So it's how can organisations overcome this natural tendency? Okay, so in each of these sessions they'll be structured in exactly the same way. I'll always start with impediments. So what are the things stopping people within organisations or organisations generally noticing the dangers and risks and uncertainties they face? And in the book we pick up on all these topics. I'll just focusing on some of these. So the first one is expectations of normality, and in the teaching session I talked about Easter Islands. This clip, which you can find, it's grayed out section at the bottom there on the slide. This clip is about Easter Island and about the way people on the island were expected normal life to just continue despite the fact that they're ravaging the resources on a very limited island, and nobody saw that this was going to lead to disaster, even as the disaster unfolded around them. What organisations need to think about is the early signals, the early weak signals of impending risk and uncertainty. Are these being missed, and why are they being missed? Okay, so why is that creeping disaster, how is it seen actually as a sudden disaster, even though often they are creeping disasters? Here's some explanations. So people get seduced by success. Okay, Valikangas, in her book The Resilient Organisation, talked about the dangers and seductions of success. So we have repeated success within organisations. So what we develop is a mental and cognitive danger, what she called a mental cognitive danger. We have hubris, narcissism, arrogance, feelings of entitlement, complacency, inattention. We all have this. We are all successful people in this university, and we start to develop this kind of hubris and arrogance, feelings of entitlement, become complacent, and this draws our attention away from the risks we face. There are behavioural dangers. We do something well, it works well, it's been successful in the past, we do it again and again and again, and this becomes our way of achieving something, even if that thing we're doing, that activity we're carrying out, has some sort of embedded problem with it. We just keep doing it over and over again, overscaling, as Valikangas calls it. Okay, and the political dangers. So we develop power coalitions and dependencies and drive out the spare resource. All of these are almost the antithesis of resilience. Okay, so there we are. So Valikangas came up with a number of ways, problems, seductions of success. Okay, another problem we think is the traditional risk management process itself. So I'm going to take you a little bit through this process and then question it. Okay, so the traditional risk management involves avoiding risk, risk mitigation, transfer of risk, and risk acceptance. So what we're doing is trying to avoid risk by cancelling it out, mitigating against possible risks, transferring risk to third parties or other people better placed to deal with that risk, pardon me, and then finally accepting what the residual. Some of the techniques we use, there's lots of techniques we can use. All these things are used in the traditional risk management process. I won't go into detail about them. You're free to read up on these if you like. But suffice to say that risk management is the process of identifying risk in risk management is quite organised and planned, and involves a lot of systems which can be applied and processes which can be applied to the identification of risk. We have qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. So qualitative risk analysis is a probability and impact assessment. Develop a matrix based on that, categorize risks, think about the urgency of different risks, and draw an expert judgment to come up with these probabilities and impacts. Quantitative approaches involve gathering data, representing those data, developing probability distributions based on data, carrying out sensitivity analysis, expected monetary value analyses, lots of different analysis processes and approaches which are used and applied in risk management in all sorts of organisations, engineering, insurance and finance, all sorts of operational manufacturing activities and service activities. Then we develop a risk response. So we go through risk reassessment, create audits, carry out variance and trend analysis, carry out technical performance measurements, and various other things we can do in order to develop our plans for responses to risk. The problem here is in the planning. So many plans, and as you can see, many plans, tools and techniques, planning tools and techniques are available to organisations. The driver is on a focus on what's measurable. Okay, so what can we measure, either qualitatively or quantitatively? What can we make sense of? Okay, the problem this leads to is that organisations, people within organisations, think they've got risk covered. They think they're on top of the risk situation which is facing their organisation, oblivious to the fact that there's a load of stuff they haven't touched because they haven't even thought about it, or it's unmeasurable, or they can't really understand it. That doesn't mean it goes away. If they ignore it, doesn't mean it goes away. It's still there, and but the danger, the seduction, if you like, the lure, is that the risk has been tamed. That is now that they've turned that risk into they've understood the risk, and that they're safe to proceed. Whereas in fact what they've done is focus on what's measurable and ignore everything which is difficult to make sense of, difficult to understand. Contino, in his book on organisational myopia, defined or talked about myopia within organisations. What myopia is short-sightedness, not being able to see far enough into the future. He said, in the first instance, there is a failure to detect signs of potential danger, which can undermine an organisation's survival. So we don't detect the signs. We can't see the signs. We're myopic within organisations. Organisations are myopic. Also, there's a failure to detect the potential opportunities, which can improve resilience and reliability. Okay, so not only do we not see the danger coming towards us because we are blind to it, but we also don't see the opportunities, and these opportunities in themselves have a possibility of developing resilience and reliability for the organisation. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of impediments. Now let's think about enablers, and this, for all the sessions henceforward, will be the next section of the teaching session. Okay, so again, there's a number of topics there which we pick up in the book. Go to our book and have a look at some of these topics in more detail if you want to. I'll focus in on just some of these. So, vigilance. How can we be vigilant? Okay, in high reliability organisation theory, this is understood as preoccupation with failure. Okay, if we're preoccupied, if everyone within the organisation, particularly those people who are at the forefront of the operations, are preoccupied with the dangers and risks, should something go wrong, what would be the consequence of that for the organisation, then they're going to be continually vigilant. Okay, and as I said in the next point, a situated individual has to be alert to subtle nuance, early warnings and deviations from the norm. In other words, they have to be aware of something that isn't going quite right and then be able to report that. This requires mindfulness, not doing things mindlessly, but doing things in a mindful way. Wyke, in his book on mindfulness, talks a lot about organisational mindfulness, what mindfulness means for organisations. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so for Wyke it has 4 dimensions. It's alertness to distinction. So what is something distinct? Is something deviating from the norm? Is an openness to novelty, recognising that novelty is out there. This may be useful, it may be a risk, it may be a danger. Orientation to in the present, that we're focused on what's going on in the here and now, and awareness of multiple perspectives. One perspective isn't enough. Lots of people have different views, and these views have to be brought to a particular problem or to a particular operational situation. Okay, there's rule-based approaches and mindfulness-based approaches, and this is important. Okay, this is really, for me, underpins a lot of what I'm talking about in this module. It's often can be seen as a continuum. So we can have a rule-based approach which is driven by procedures and policies and documentation and repetition of process over and over and over again, following rules and procedures. So we carry out operating procedures, and we do this on a continuous basis, and it's all about driving towards efficiency. The obverse of that, the other side of the continuum of that, is mindfulness-based approaches, which are focusing on effectiveness, effective operation, which for me is about reliability and resilience. And these two things are in tension and pulling apart. So organisations are oscillating, I think, between these two things. They want to be efficient, so they gear towards rule-based approaches. But at the same time, organisations, I think, recognise that if they're too rigid and too focused on rules, then they lose sight of those small signals that something might be going wrong. They lose their flexibility they need in the face of uncertainty. So there's a continual kind of pull in both directions. Okay, there's a little diagram talking about mindfulness. One of the things we picked up in the teaching session, which I think is important, is this notion of practical drift. Okay, so it comes back to this idea of rules and procedures and the danger of rules and procedures being overly driven by a rule-based approach. Okay, so organisations rely on rules and procedures, plans and protocols. I'm not saying these are unimportant. They're actually crucial to most organisations. All organisations have rules, procedures, plans, protocols and ways of doing things which are written down, documented and set out how organisations go about their operations. So they're crucial to organisations. The problem is that they too much focus on procedures and rules makes an organisation brittle. Okay, and one of the ways that brittleness manifests itself is in this notion of practical drift, that people seek easier, maybe cheaper, faster, quicker, more convenient ways of achieving their tasks. In other words, they take shortcuts. Over time, behaviour which is locally efficient, in other words, these little shortcuts which people have established and which they do on a regular basis, become acquired in practice. They become normal and they become legitimised through unremarkable repetition. Okay, and this is an observation of Snook. So in the case at the end of this session, and we talked about practical drift and the Black Hawk Down case, which Scott Snook explores. He said that when the rules do not match the situation, pragmatic individuals adjust their behaviour accordingly. They act in ways that better align with their perceptions of current demands. In short, they break the rules. They break the rules despite the rules being there. But because organisations are so focused on the rules-based approaches and procedures and lose a sense of mindfulness, everything seems fine until something goes wrong. What are the causes of practical drift? The tighter the rules, the greater the potential for sizable practical drift to occur. Practical drift is inevitable. Scott Snook said it was rooted in human behaviour. We all do it. We all take shortcuts. Adding or lengthening procedures increases the potential for practical drift. So if you layer procedure upon procedure, practical drift is more inevitable even, if you can say that. Ideally, the right way to accomplish a task should also be the easiest way. So, a mindful organisation will have rules and procedures in place, but what they'll also do is spend time watching how other operators work, how people carry out the operations for the organisation. The process involves starting with how tasks are being done. What are people doing in local practice? And how does this compare to how things should be done? Okay, operators, people carrying out the operations of the organisation, should help design the procedure. In other words, the procedure always is changing and adapting, but that change and adaptation isn't practical drift, because what's happening is that it's being recognised and understood and always considered, and that change is a considered variant on the previous procedure. So what Snook said was that organisations religiously update procedures, or should religiously update procedures, in line with current practice. The outcomes of practical drift are: things may seem fine for extended periods. Things go on and on with no problems. In the case that Snook looked at, over 1,000 days. Successful repetition masks hidden fatal flaws, as he calls them, in the new procedures. The new procedures aren't really new procedures, they're the way things are done through practical drift, which are different to procedures, and they're not actually defined procedures. No one knows they're new procedures. Without procedures, mistakes occur. Deviation from policies. The errors aren't even noticed and often are accumulated. So they accumulate over time, so it's this gradual development towards disaster. The crisis emerges without even being noticed, because organisations just aren't able to see this problem occurring. Okay, and here's a way of thinking about the relationship between predictability and uncertainty. Okay, so over time, the degree of predictability reduces and the level of uncertainty increases. In the early stages, we can do forecasting. Okay, we can think about collecting data, planning for what's going on, and what we're doing is measuring risk. As time goes on, as our time horizon extends into the future, we have to find other ways of doing things. What we talk about in our book is something which is quite well understood within the literature, scenario planning, but applying that to resilience and reliability. Okay, so what is scenario planning? Trying to see those future things. Okay, so strategic anticipation is the core of scenario planning. It's a strategic process. Okay, it promotes the identification and exploitation of emerging opportunities. It's about anticipating long-term trends. So this process of anticipating long-term things which are going on in the environment, which are happening within our industry, which are happening within society, these are things we need to try and capture and build into our strategic planning. Okay, all sorts of processes are used, simulation games, combining known facts with plausible underpinning. We look at social, technical, economic and political trends. And all these things are happening all the time, and we can see this happening around us all the time. Here's a little model to illustrate scenario planning. So the process normally involves a series of scenarios. I've got A, B, C there, could be more. And gives us an area of plausible futures. Okay, one of the crucial things that scenario planning does is include crazy or what they call wild card scenarios, crazy ideas which are, so unlikely and unfeasible that the chances of them happening are next to nothing. And yet these are included in the process of scenario planning, considered along with all those plausible futures, to develop a series of possibilities that the organisation might face. How does scenario planning happen? It's about involving stakeholders. Stakeholders are customers, consumers, people within the organisation, suppliers and partners, government agencies, all sorts of people are involved in organisations and organisational life, and these are all stakeholders. It normally has a defined time and scope. The focus is on what's driving, what's happening now, and how that might turn out in the future. It's about identifying the key uncertainties. Crucially, it considers extremes. So those wildcard scenarios I talked about earlier, those are important. Okay, another way in which organisations can help with things like scenario planning and better understanding and creating mindfulness within the organisation is through cross-functional teams. These are self-directed teams with members from multiple disciplines. They all come together, okay, and the idea is to develop creative thinking. So it's not one-directional, it's not unidirectional, it's about getting wide amounts of information and bringing that to bear on the discussion. It's about getting a wide range of users involved, and it's not about goals. Okay, it's about process, and it's about understanding all sorts of possible futures. This term mimetic isomorphism is about organisations aping or copying successful organisations around them. Who's the best here in class? Who's the best in our industry? We'll do just what they do. Okay, it's called mimetic isomorphism. The point about carrying out scenario planning, the point about trying to develop mindfulness within your organisation is that you're not aping what other organisations do. You're not trying to be the same as the best. You're trying to be the best in your own terms. Okay, so some futures, some scenarios. Over the last 2 decades, or decade really, the price of oil's plunged. I argue that this was one of the reasons why the Deepwater Horizon circumstances occurred, because BP became more and more driven by process and efficiency in the face of falling revenues. Another example of a future scenario which was regarded as crazy at the time, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Organisations, and one of the famous organisation, a bank in West Germany at the time, who were prepared for the fall of the Berlin Wall because they carried out some scenario planning. And somebody had come with the crazy idea that the Berlin Wall might come down. Okay, this is a picture from the Dead Sea in Israel. One of the futures which a lot of people within society, a lot of organisations face is an increasing battle over limited water supplies. This is, some people are predicting this to be a major cause of clashes in the future, particularly in the Middle East. Okay, and this one's supposed to represent globalisation. Big organisations taking over the world and becoming, in some cases, larger than countries. Okay, other things, rather than just focusing on scenario planning, other things that organisations can do, things like the Delphi method, game theory, rational choice theory, dynamic analysis and replanning, leverage points. These are all well-known and well-understood prediction tools which are used by some organisations to try and see into the future, to see that uncertainty and make sense of it and try to prepare for the uncertainty and build resilience into the organisations. I'm not going to go into detail about those. Some of them picked up in our book, and you're welcome to read around them. Okay, so the next section in all these teaching sessions is enablers. How do we enable noticing in this case? Okay, some of the things we pick on our book are battling complacency, moving the onus of proof, helping people to imagine, stripping adversity of negative connotations, focusing on issues rather than being the messenger, and showing adversity. I'm going to pick up on just some of these. Okay, so how can we battle complacency? One of the things we can do is make people feel uncomfortable. You can actually go out of your way to make people feel uncomfortable within the organisation. That discomfort forces people to think about uncertainty and become less complacent. You can invite sceptical outsiders, people from outside, critical friends they're sometimes called, to come in and talk about what we might feel complacent about. If it isn't broken, if things aren't working, think about breaking it, or at least think about what would happen if it was broken. Cultivate nightmare scenarios, what if situations. And one of the real concerns about organisations, which I've identified with my research with others, is a tick boxing mentality. Tick, tick, tick. Yes, we ticked all the situations, all the checklist, and we can move on. And this is a real danger for people in I'll revisit that point later on in the module. Okay. We can also investigate how new disruptive technologies can alter our situation. Okay. Technology is changing at a pace, and the changes in technology are changing the way organisations go about their business. It's creating major concerns for organisations of all sorts. Also, setting outrageous goals. We're never going to achieve these goals, but they're outrageous for a purpose. They're outrageous to make us less complacent within the organisation. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on this too much. This is just Hayes and Wheelwright's model from operations management. And the reason I have this in here is because it was a way of thinking about how an organisation can push itself forward, what it's trying to achieve strategically, and how this can be understood operationally. So it's a four-stage model, classic four-stage model, and in this model, in the first stage, the operations are holding the organisation back, what Hayes and Millwright called internally neutral. In the second stage, you get as good as your competitors. In other words, you're externally neutral. By the third stage, the operations of organisations are best in practice or best in industry, become internally supportive. And at the fourth stage, which organisations are seeking to achieve, they're redefining the industry's expectations. They're changing the way the operations of that industry are carried out. They're externally supportive. Okay, so W.B. Yeats talked about the idea of reason and a lack of imagination. That's the reason I got that quote there is because what I'm going to talk a little bit about is this idea of being imaginative. Organisations, in order to see things, in order to see different scenarios, see different futures, avoid mimetic isomorphism, avoid complacency, avoid just doing the same thing over and over and over again because it's worked in the past, people within organisations need to use their imagination. The problem is that corporate man is, as De Vries called him, the problem with corporate man is that corporate man is seen as a rational being. We're not rational, people aren't rational, but we're seen as being rational. Okay, and corporate man in particular, the suited man or suited woman, corporate woman could equally be, is super rational. What De Vries called alexithymia. I can't pronounce that. Alexithymia. There we are, it's better. Okay, it is no worse for emotion. We avoid emotion, we strike emotion out of our business activities, out of the way we see our operations, and so we constrict imaginative process, as evidenced by a scarcity of fantasy. Okay, the corporate man is super adjusted to reality, super present, but what they don't see is all sorts of possible futures and possible ways in which things might turn out. Okay, it's about getting past the superficial impression of superb functioning of collecting spreadsheets full of data, which reveal nothing but sterility and the monotony of ideas and an impoverished imagination. Without imagination, man within organisations will not see possible futures and will not see the flaws which are embedded within their organisation. Okay, so Brennan came with this really interesting hierarchy of imagination. At the bottom we have reflex, an instinctive and immediate reaction to external stimuli. Next level is problem solving. Most people can do this. So we all have reflex, we all have problem solving, which is constrained by reality. And then we have creativity. It's a bit rarer within organisations. Ideas rubbing together, two good ideas rubbing together, boundary applied imagination, and then finally we have imagination itself, unconstrained, pure and unapplied views of the world, something frowned upon within lots of organisations. Okay, but you can see this is from Mader's book Redesigning Leadership, which is published by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Press. It is a book which focuses on thinking about different ways of understanding leadership, and then one of the key ways of that is to develop imagination. And so Brennan's hierarchy is very useful for thinking about the way we can build imagination onto some other things we do much more normally, like problem solving and just reflex, just carrying out things, doing things over and over again. Okay, so the next section in our book is, and next section in all these teaching sessions is about noticing across organisations. Sorry, not noticing, but whatever we're interested in, happening across organisations. So in this case, it's noticing across organisations. It's seeing across organisations and seeing outside our own organisation. And there's 4 areas here which we pick up in our book. I'll touch on some of this. Okay, so Rock talked about certainty, and certainty itself feels rewarding, that we tend to steer towards it. It's this lure of uncertainty that I talked about at the beginning of this session. Okay, our brains like certainty, even the illusion of uncertainty. He came up with the SCARF model, and the C on that is certainty. It's, on the one hand, we try to reduce threat, and on the other hand, we increase reward. And we get rewarded for reduction in threat. Okay, so that's the background to the problems we face. The idea of noticing beyond boundaries is to co-opt stakeholders, so suppliers, customers, government, agencies, other agencies, in our seeking out what's going on both within the organisation and outside the organisation, developing longer term relationships with key suppliers and other stakeholders. The example I gave was the Birmingham Business School Advisory Board, and there they are, lots of different people from industry, from other parts of the university, from within the business school, and from other academics, all of whom come together to help shape the direction of the business school into the future. Okay, I talked about idle resources. One of the key aspects of high reliability organisations is a redundancy, built-in redundancy. That essentially is idle resource. The problem is, who pays for those idle resources? No one wants to pay for them. Okay. The way to think about this is to think about value-creating activities. So, what is value to our organisation? Value-creating activities are activities leading towards the delivery of outputs and outcomes, which we all want. Okay. Then there are also value-preserving activities. So, one is the outcome and the output, but the other is how do we create the environment in which the operations take place so that we can keep delivering that value to our customers, consumers, and whomever else we're trying to deliver for. Okay. Now, redundant resources allow the value-preserving activities, this is what I argue, allow the value-preserving activities to be put in place so that we can, over the long term, keep delivering outputs and outcomes without a super rational focus on efficiency. Okay. This redundant resource equals, for me, robustness. And of course the obverse, the lack of redundancy, equals brittleness. Okay, returning to Valikangas, she talked about robust organisational design. Okay, we can think about structural robustness. This is about modularity. It's about organisations broken down, split up, so that they're not, and suppliers and other organisations who we're dependent on becoming less dependent on them, spreading our risk and ensuring that we can continue to operate despite the vicissitudes we face within organisational life. We can have strategic robustness, in other words, strategic redundancy, which is a portfolio of options, a portfolio of options, what she called adaptive managerial capabilities, which are cognitive, strategic, political, and ideological. And then finally, she talks about behavioural robustness, behavioural redundancy. So this is developing an idiosyncratic network of multi-vocality, lots of different views, lots of different opinions, which aren't which are outside the normal, which are different, and that difference leads to a behavioural robustness for Valikangas. Okay, and at the end I talk about some of the takeaway points. So some of the things which I picked up on here: pass, assess and normality are seductive. Traditional risk management focuses on the measurable, And the problem with that is that what we can't measure, we ignore. Scenario planning offers a structured methodology for looking into the future, but it requires organisations to overcome complacency. And complacency is a real problem for organisations, and procedure-driven mentalities rather than mindfulness. Okay, wider stakeholder groups help to broaden perspectives, and a key requirement of high reliability organisations is redundancy. The problem organisations face is thinking about how this can be accommodated in a organisational setting that focuses on operational efficiency, delivering value to customers, but at the same time forgetting the wider environment within which those operations occur. And then the case we looked at was Friendly Fire, Scott Snook's book, which picked up on this notion of practical drift.